The UK was the first in the world to distribute coronavirus vaccines to the public in early December. More than a month later, and only a handful of less wealthy nations are finally getting their jabs. Brazil started inoculations on Saturday.
We've overcome many obstacles to be here today. A day of hope, hope of having hope, hope of acting.
Meanwhile, authorities in India have begun shipping doses to remote parts of the country.
I was a bit tense when we got stuck in traffic and I began wondering about whether we would be able to make it on time or not. I was thinking about alternative routes to use. But eventually, we arrived on time.
Rich countries have been vaccinating their people for weeks. That's given them a head start to getting their economies back up to speed. But that could be unsustainable, because what happens in developing economies will still affect them. The World Health Organization says advanced economies stand to lose $2.4 trillion in output due to vaccine delays in their less wealthy counterparts. In total, the global economy would lose $4.4 trillion or nearly 6% of GDP. These losses would be the result of supply chain disruptions in developing nations unable to control the pandemic. The WHO is calling for more contributions to COVAX, an international project to deliver vaccines to emerging economies. It's currently $27 billion short of its $38 billion goal for testing, treatments, and vaccines for poor countries.
With the right level of funding in place, COVAX could procure 2.3 billion doses of vaccines in 2021. That's enough to protect about 27% of the population in those low and lower middle income countries, which is in excess of the initial targets we laid out to protect those at highest risk.
But as the WHO cranks up the pressure, rich countries are still struggling with the evolving nature of the pandemic. The US is expected to halt entries from South Africa due to a more contagious strain of COVID-19. European countries like Germany and the UK are also tightening lockdowns over a surge in new infections. And those are emerging despite the rollout of vaccines. Paolo Montecillo, TRT World.
Well, for more on this, let's go to Dr. Andrea Feigl in Washington. She's a health economist and the founder and CEO of the Health Finance Institute. Welcome back to the program, Doctor. Now, the most extreme scenario is that wealthy nations will become fully vaccinated by the middle of the year, say, and poorer countries will be largely shut out. Firstly, why would this be a disaster from a health point of view?
Thanks so much for having me again. And indeed, of course, if the vaccination fails to be rolled out, and as we've seen now, more contagious strains are emerging, that would mean a much larger chronic disease burden due to long COVID, as well as increased mortality. But even more so, the COVID crisis has shown us that health comes first in a generation of wealth, and that there's an interdependence, especially rich countries with a lot of exposure to international trade could suffer also greatly from economic losses. So it's really both the health and the wealth that's at stake here.
Yeah, so this does lead me to my next question, because the study commissioned by the International Chamber of Commerce concludes that the global economy could stand to lose around $9 trillion, with half of those losses being suffered by wealthy nations, not just the poorer ones, if poorer communities don't actually get access to a safe and effective vaccine. Can you tell us more about why it is that wealthy nations, despite having their populations vaccinated, would also suffer the economic consequences of poorer nations missing out?
Yes, so the study obviously shows a range of potential losses, and the $9 trillion are on the upper end. However, it does paint a very stark picture that if we don't act together to get our health in order, we also won't get our economic growth in order. And the reason that there is such an interdependence between health and economic growth is because, as we've seen, there's this continuous cycles of lockdowns and and lowering of demand in trade, and the inability, just because of a weakened society, because of a weaker health status, to make sure that supply chains are kept, that the high income countries depend on, are kept moving along. So it can impact supply chains in developing nations. And as more infectious strains emerge, such as the one in South Africa, and countries are starting to close their borders again, you will see a decline in international trade, and especially high-income countries that depend on the production power of developing countries will gain, will stand to lose more.
So what's your assessment of the current state of the global pandemic? We know we have vaccines that are being rolled out in various parts of the world, but as you mentioned, there are now seemingly more infectious and possibly more deadly strains of coronavirus out there. Is it better or worse than at the beginning of the pandemic last year?
I oscillate between hope and dread. Hope because of the vaccine, and dread because of the emergence of the new strains that become potentially more infectious and can escape the vaccine, as we have seen with the one in South Africa. So it is really right now a sort of a stage 2.0 of the pandemic, where we have a new tool, which is wonderful, the vaccine. And if we really invest in the rollout of the vaccine globally, and enable developing nations as well as high-income countries. When you look at the US, when you look at European countries, we're not doing so well. We have to really fight this together, but we have new tools available. Obviously, the danger is that we are not fast enough globally. We encourage new mutations by this lagging approach. And let's hope that we can beat that fight, really, win in that fight.
Okay, Dr. Andrea Feigl in Washington. We'll have to leave it there, but thank you again for joining us on the program.
Thank you so much.